You're listening to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast, a podcast which features students and early career professionals who work in the alternative protein industry, where they discuss their journeys and deliver advice on how you can start a career in this revolutionary field. One career path which I've yet to showcase on this podcast is that of an author or writer. Well, that is exactly the path which this episode's guest has followed so far. George Stiffman, also known as the Tofu Guy, is a tofu evangelist and author of the book Broken Cuisine. Through his travels in China, where he worked in Buddhist restaurant kitchens, apprenticed under a fifth-generation tofu master, studied at a Chinese university, spoke at food industry conferences, and ate across numerous cities, towns, and villages, he was able to learn more about the various different types of tofu. Yes, there are more varieties of tofu beyond silken, soft, firm, and extra firm. He also learned about the incredible ways that it can enhance the culinary experience. George's goal is to encourage a greater adoption of tofu within the Western diet, which he does through promoting his book on tofu and consulting with restaurants. He has a bachelor's degree in East Asian languages and culture with a minor in consumer behavior from the University of Southern California. Without further ado, I present to you my conversation with George, where we discuss his experiences in China, what led him to write his book Broken Cuisine, and what that process entailed. Welcome, George, to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast. I'm extremely delighted to speak with you today and learn more about your journey and what led you to write a book on tofu.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeffrey. Excited to chat.
Excellent. As a starting off question, I noticed on your LinkedIn profile you consider yourself a tofu evangelist. Can you elaborate on why you consider yourself that?
Yeah, well, tofu in the States, for a number of reasons, has a pretty bad rep outside of the Asian American community. And part of the reason seems to be when tofu was first promoted outside of immigrant communities that had been eating tofu for a long time, it was promoted largely as a sustainable food and as a health food, and not so much as an incredible ingredient that could be super versatile and do all these culinary things. So when I did some research, we ran a survey that asked Californians, how much tofu do you eat on average? And the numbers shocked me because we were getting that people were eating between 1 and 3 blocks of tofu a year as people who seem to fit the flexitarian sort of mold of more aware of food issues and interested in sustainability and interested in animal issues. So that to me was crazy. On the flip side, I ended up spending some time in China, living there for about 2 years, and was amazed by all these things that tofu could do. There's a ton of vegan food and vegetarian food in China, and largely it's because there are these protein options that allow chefs to do incredible things with plants. My goal is just to help grow awareness for tofu in the US and start growing this market, fighting the misconceptions, really helping home cooks navigate these ingredients. And I think a tofu evangelist is sort of my catch-all for that. Sure, I've written about tofu, but I don't think author captures it.
All right. So you've obviously learned a lot about tofu, and that's what led you to write Broken Cuisine. So for listeners who haven't read the book but are interested in reading it, could you give us a brief overview of it?
Broken Cuisine dives into 5 rare types of tofu that most Americans haven't ever tried and just aren't familiar with. And it specifically looks at how home cooks can incorporate these ingredients into more Western style cuisines. The inspiration for the book came from this personal frustration that I had when I went plant-based in high school. It felt like there were 3 main options in my city. The first was subtractive plant-based foods. These were like getting a meat dish without the meat, and things just felt lesser. The second option was substitutive plant-based foods. These were like getting a veggie burger or plant-based meat subbed in. And while the options are getting better and better, at that time and still today, I'm not quite satisfied with just those foods. The third options were the most appealing to me. They were traditional foods that just were always plant-based. Foods like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, or chana masala, or Ethiopian misir wat. And so I started learning more about various cuisines and fell in love with Chinese food and spent some time in China with the goal eventually of trying to learn as much as I could about vegan Chinese cooking that I could share some of it back home. The challenge, though, I ran into was that even though I really loved a lot of these foods and I love to explore and learn about other cultures, I found that even in LA, where I live now, it's not common to really want to explore outside of what you're comfortable with. And it's, for most people, it's not scalable. And so the reason the book is called Broken Cuisine is that I'm sure your listeners are all familiar with food issues, and our meat-based diets in the US are leading to climate change and animal suffering and poor health and antibiotic resistance. But our plant-based cuisine is not tasty enough, I think, for most eaters to really shift over. And the solution we talk about in the book is learning from other cuisines that have really nailed plant-based cooking, like Chinese food, and start incorporating more of these tools. And the tools we talk about in the book are Chinese tofus, and specifically rare varieties that are pretty different from the standard white tofu blocks and aren't yet super popular, but I think could be.
You mentioned that there's different types of tofu. Can you maybe briefly elaborate on what those different types of tofu are? I'm only familiar with, I presume it's probably likely only one style, but like there's different textures, like there's soft, firm, and extra firm, but I presume that's not exactly what you mean when you say different types of tofu.
It's wild in that in the States, tofu is this softer, jiggly white block that's more or less moisture content. But in China and in Greater Asia, it's a whole category of proteins with 27 different types at least.
Whoa.
Conventional tofu, those blocks, is made by taking soy milk and adding a coagulant, a salt or an acid, that binds the proteins together. They precipitate and clump and form these beautiful curds, sort of like dairy cheese. Then those curds are bound together and they're put into a mold and pressed into a cake. And so that's your conventional tofu. But it doesn't necessarily stop there. If you ferment the tofu or change the pH or dehydrate it, you can arrive at a lot of other varieties. There's also tofus that don't start as a block. You can press those curds into a paper thin sheet and do a number of things with those. You can also, instead of curdling your tofu, there's similar foods that are made by skimming the layer off of soy milk, the top layer that's high in protein and rich and fatty. And there's other varieties that are made directly from soy protein. So sounds very abstract. You know, what actually do these taste like? Well, there are tofus that melt when you heat them up. They literally liquefy. There are tofus that have an eggy texture that you add them to soup, they almost turn into some sort of matzo ball-like consistency.
Really?
Yeah, and that tofu actually has twice as much protein as firm tofu. It's just super dense, but because of the way it's made, it's really tender and custardy. And you have other types that have a structure that's a little bit jiggly, but it's jiggly and tender, but it also has cohesiveness that almost tastes like a fish cake. And on and on and on. I mean, you have tofus that are really funky and taste like aged cheese, and other tofus that are so stinky that you can smell them a block away when they're being cooked on the street. And you go to certain regions of China where you'll find tofus that are eaten nowhere else in the country. And they're a local craft of certain villages. There's so much intricacies that go into tofu. And in the States, it's really sad right now because people aren't very aware of these outside of the Asian American community.
Yeah, it's a shame. But it kind of blows my mind that there's that many types. I had no idea. And it fascinates me still to this day that Well, you can have the same, more or less, ingredient inputs, but just changes to the different process can lead to wildly different products or tofu styles and tastes and textures.
Well, from a culinary vantage point, each of these varieties has their own unique characteristics. Things that it does really well, or certain things that chefs can lean into. And so if you took a chef at your local eatery and you said, okay, you have 20 new tools to cook plant-based with, but as soon as you start adding in more diversity, I think the cuisine itself can grow.
Yeah. It's quite impressive that there's so many different styles of tofu and the versatility of it. Was the reason behind going to China to learn about these different types of tofu?
Not at all.
Oh.
In high school, I just had a teammate on the tennis team who did a language and homestay program one summer in China, and it changed his life. Around that time, I was also starting to become interested in studying the Chinese language, Mandarin, and had grown up eating a lot of Chinese food and was always sort of interested in Chinese history from our classes and Chinese art. So it was just all these little factors that made me curious about the culture. And after that, I spent one summer doing a similar program to my friend. And like him, it changed my life.
So how would you say that it changed your life, that experience there?
Well, when I got there, I got really lucky because I was placed with a family that were huge foodies. I'm talking, we would go out every single night to a new restaurant.
Oh, wow.
And for 5 of us, it would be my host parents and my host aunt and uncle. We would order like 15 dishes. Every night was a different sub-cuisine within China. So I was just falling in love. And around that time, I was getting interested in plant-based food and realized that there was so much plant-based food that it wasn't even necessarily trying to be plant-based. It was just people ate a lot of this stuff. So around that time, I became more aware of tofu. And once I went fully vegetarian and then vegan, I became pretty excited about studying more in depth.
Okay, I see. So, based on your experience there in China, what is the Chinese cultural perspective on tofu and other alternative proteins?
There's a couple ways to look at it. The first is vegan Chinese food and vegetarian Chinese food has a long history, at least probably almost 2,000 years. And there's sort of 3 main branches of vegetarian plant-based Chinese food. The first and the most commonly talked about is Buddhist and Taoist temple food. In those cultures, it's bad to kill animals, and so Buddhists in China often are vegetarian, or if they're not vegetarian, they will be vegetarian twice a month for certain days of the week. On the flip side, you also have what's called popular vegetarianism. And what popular vegetarianism is just those traditional foods that people eat all around the country. Some are very specific to regions, some are more broad, and they just don't have meat to begin with. The third branch is this imperial vegetarianism. There was an emperor in the Qing dynasty who was Buddhist, but he still had a big appetite. And so he would instruct legions of chefs to essentially create ornate meals for him with these foods that looked like meat, but that were actually plant-based. A lot of the mock meat traditions in China actually came from that specific culture in the Qing dynasty. In terms of the tofu question, tofu has been eaten in China for at least 1,000 or 2,000 years. It's not clear exactly when it was invented, but there's certain myths around that. Nowadays, even though tofu is a very popular food and that a lot of people love the flavors and textures, it also has a bit of stigma in that it's a plant-based protein, it's cheap, and because it's cheap, it was eaten a lot back in the olden days before China's economic growth. Whereas now that meat's cheaper and more accessible, people tend to want to eat more meat, and tofu is seen as sort of a relic of poverty. Again, not entirely. Obviously, people eat a ton of tofu in China, but there are those connotations.
Yeah, I can sort of understand that. All right, well, I want to talk a little bit more about your experience writing the book Broken Cuisine. So, what was the exact moment where you had the idea of like, hey, maybe I should write a book on tofu?
Originally, out of college, I started working on a startup project, and I spent about a year working on it with a couple different pivots, but towards the end became pretty disheartened with the idea of commercializing a frozen food product that people could heat up at home that would be using one of these rare types of tofu. It just seemed very difficult, and there wasn't a clear market and stuff like that. But when I was working on that final product, I started thinking about working with a chef in LA to refine the product. And so I met this great chef named Vanessa Lauren, who had been running her own catering business and doing private dinners, and previously was a contestant on some cooking competitions with Anthony Bourdain, who was a mentor of hers. And she was interested in writing a book on vegan food, even though she's not vegan. So we ended up talking about it. And for me, it was sort of a nice change of pace getting to work with a professional in the kitchen who could create amazing foods and at the same time start creating more infrastructure so that people who can understand actually deeper how these tofus work. If we sold a frozen meal, say like a French toast using Shanghai tofu, well, buyers might like it and like the taste, but they're not necessarily going to trace it back and say, oh, that was Shanghai tofu. What do I do with Shanghai tofu? Well, I don't know. There's no recipes in English on the internet. Versus the book approach was sort of, let's create some foundational knowledge. So we have a level playing field. Everyone can know about these foods. And then if you're a chef or you're a home cook, you can start messing around yourself. So it's not just my team working on it.
Right. Okay, that makes more sense. And so what was the exact process of writing the book? Like I've never written a book before. I don't know what you have to go through. Like what was the step-by-step things that you had to do, or what was some of the logistical aspect of getting a book from ideation to publication?
Wow. Well, there was a lot that went into it. And it started somewhat systematically. There's books on Amazon about writing your own book. And I chose, instead of to go the traditional route of hiring an agent or pitching to an agent and then having that agent pitch my manuscript to a publishing house, which would then buy the rights to my book and pay me in advance and then take charge of a lot of the stuff beyond writing and marketing. I instead decided to publish myself, which means you have to take charge of the broader part of the process. Things like finding an editor, things like finding a designer to help lay out the book, figuring out cover design, figuring out photography, things like how are we going to print the book. There's a lot of factories in the US that will print different types of book. In some cases, it's large batch orders with so-called offset printing techniques. In other cases, it's more of every time you want a copy, they'll print one off, print on demand. And so had to navigate what are those options and which are going to best fit our goals. And some of those online resources really helped create that map. And then we just kind of started and we just went for it. Vanessa, my original chef partner, had a friend who was also a chef named David Lesprawn, who was the executive chef at a big Japanese restaurant in LA and loved tofu because of that. So they decided to tag team on recipe development, and we created a framework around what sort of recipes we want to put in the book. The main criteria were things like each recipe needs to be based around the strength of the tofu it's using. We don't want to focus too much on just substituting one for one, like tofu for meat, unless the tofu is adding something really unique. We wanted to focus on 5 types of tofus, not repeat techniques too much. And things that focus on more Western style flavors and cooking techniques rather than Chinese or Asian styles. And once we created those sorts of ground rules, David and Vanessa would do recipe testing, and then once a week or once every other week, I would come out and we would do a big tasting. And we'd say, oh, this recipe is really good. Maybe we should shift this a little bit. Or other recipes were like, this is not going to work. We should cut it. And at that point, once recipes were ready to go, they would send me the basic skeleton, like the proportions and the cooking instructions, and then I would type that up and make it more literary, add a description. And then once I had all those descriptions, I would test them myself to make sure they work for a home cook. And we do back and forth to clarify things. Once that was set, I would pass those recipes on to first our editor, who would read through, make sure there weren't any glaring typos. If there was any structures that were kind of weird, she would help with that. Then we would pass the recipe over to our designer. She created a template for recipes, what sort of formatting we wanted to look like on the page, and then she would lay it all out. Along the way, we do photo shoots with one of Vanessa's friends, Ryan Tanaka, who's a great food and beverage photographer in Los Angeles. So he would shoot everything, and after that point, we had a lot of the pieces ready to go. I would do another proofread, just look through one more time, try to catch any errors. We'd go back and forth. And beyond the recipes, there were other things like we needed an introduction that explained what we're talking about. What are Chinese tofus? Why do they matter? I think that was the main process of writing. There was also, we had to find a factory to print our books. And we were originally going to go with one based in the US that also has nice distribution networks. But the paper quality was just too poor to really be doable for a cookbook. And so we ended up having to find some factories in China and get samples, go back and forth with them to make sure we knew what we needed, and eventually found a shipping company that could help us import. So a lot went on. Besides the actual creation of the book, there was the marketing and the launch stuff, and there were also managing the team dynamics, things like that.
It sounds like really it was a great learning experience for you. Well, as we wrap up the episode here, I was just wondering if you have any advice for job seekers in the alternative protein space, or people who want to help promote tofu or learn more about tofu.
In terms of advice to younger job seekers or people who want to work in alt protein, one thing that I wish more people thought about is what's the end game with alt protein? Because there's a few different narratives. The main narrative right now that organizations like GFI are pushing and a lot of alt protein companies is that once we get products that taste as good as meat, have cost parity, and are convenient, that people are going to switch over en masse. Some people think switching over en masse means 10% of eaters will become vegetarian. And that would be incredible. That would be so great for the climate and for animals. But it's not 100%. It's still a very small part of the pie. Versus other people have much higher faith that it's going to switch over a lot more meat consumption. And so if you're interested in working in alt protein, I would recommend doing more deep diving yourself and figuring out your own worldview and sort of evaluating these takes. I tend to think it's valuable to explore other options like non-plant-based meats, non-cultivated meat, not things that are trying to be meat, but also just traditional proteins like tofu. And I think focusing on the culinary side rather than just the scientific side seems valuable. Another piece of advice that has helped me, and I don't know if this is going to help everyone, but because I took a niche approach to this area, I've been able to connect with and meet a lot of really cool people. And that's not to say that it's translated into a lot of success so far, because I'm still really early, but it also has opened up a lot of doors, differentiating myself a little bit. One thing I guess I wish I did a little bit more in college was get more concrete job experience. I spent most of my summers in China just doing food stuff and learned a lot. But if I spent even one summer interning at a larger food business that has SOPs and structure, I think that would have helped me a bit.
I think that's terrific advice for anyone who wants to learn more, get in this industry. And yeah, definitely want to think long term about the end game and how you can eventually achieve your long term goals.
Absolutely.
All right. Is there anything else that you want to add or discuss?
I would say if you're interested in exploring tofu in any ways, and it could be thinking about working in the tofu space or looking for cool project opportunities, or even just you're curious about the culinary side or the China side, as long as I have time, I am very happy to chat with people and meet other tofu lovers.
What is the best way for people to reach out to you?
The best way is probably email. My email is georgestiffman@gmail.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at, currently it's George Stiffman, but I might end up changing the handle, or on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in exploring some of these 5 tofus that we wrote our book on, you can find our book on Amazon if you're in the US. And if you're not in the US or you want a cheaper e-version, we have a free one on our website, which is brokencuisine.com. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll find a link to download it. That's all I got. Thanks so much for having me, Jeffrey. This was a lot of fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed the experience, and I will provide links to all of those in the show notes for anyone who wants to follow up on that. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story, and it's been so great to speak with you again.
Likewise.
George is an example that being extremely passionate about one particular thing can sometimes turn into a career. This is again another reason why there's a place for everyone, including you, to be a part of the alternative protein revolution. If you want to learn more about careers in the alternative protein industry, please follow the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast on Instagram for weekly posts about episode releases, alternative protein resources, job boards, career advice, and so much more. Also, to find your dream job in the alternative protein industry, sign up to join the Talus Network. A link is provided in the show notes.